Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here this morning on the first day of the Netroots conference. My name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I'm the Executive Director of Muslim Counter Publics Lab. Our mission is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. We're really excited to be here. There is an exhibit outside of these doors to the left called Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat, which is a timeline of the war on terror from 2001 to 2021. So I encourage you all to look at it because when we talk about Islamophobia, particularly in this panel, we're talking about it as something that has manifested for years, decades, right, and centuries. So this panel is called Beyond the Muslim Ban, Taking on Islamophobia Globally. If you've been following, of course, the news in the last 9 months, where the US has been supporting and backing Israel's genocide of the Palestinians, we know that this country is wholly committed to the destruction of Palestinian lives, Arab lives, and Muslim lives. Some of you, and maybe not in this room, but some people might be fooled because on occasion, President Biden will tweet out things like, "Happy Islamic New Year." In fact, he did that on Monday. And he wished us, along with Jill Biden, love, peace, and prosperity amidst a genocide. Last month, when it was the Eid celebration, he tweeted again saying, "Eid Mubarak," and acknowledged that it was, quote, "a difficult time for Muslims." I wonder why it was a difficult time for Muslims. Nevertheless, we're at a point now where our conversations on Islamophobia have largely been reduced to talking about the Muslim ban, particularly in the electoral cycle, right? One of Biden's campaign promises was to repeal the Muslim ban, and indeed he did. However, he has sustained, as do they all, the state violence that has become characteristic of the war on terror that is very much rooted in Islamophobia. You might also know, and this was included in Biden's Eid greetings, that the Biden administration has been saying that they are going to release a strategy on combating Islamophobia. Again, we need to look at these efforts, symbolic gestures, as what they are, layers of violence. Because it makes no sense, of course, to release a strategy guide on combating Islamophobia when the state is one of its greatest perpetuators. So the war on terror has been a bipartisan effort in the last 22 plus years, right? Talking about the Muslim ban is only getting to the surface, right? The war on terror has involved militarism, warfare. Numerous countries, Muslim majority countries, have been bombed, destroyed. Lives have been lost. Actually, let me not talk like the New York Times. The US government has killed hundreds of thousands, murdered Muslims. And yet, all we can talk about is whether or not Muslims want to face deportation if they don't vote for Biden. So when we talk about, though, Islamophobia globally, right? The US war on terror has not only involved a large portion of the world in its efforts, but has also served as a blueprint for other countries, right? Talking about India, China, Myanmar, Israel, and supplying the rhetoric of terrorism and the construction of Muslims as the enemy other, of course, has further served to weaponize our communities. Meanwhile, right, while this Muslim threat continues to be manufactured and regurgitated over and over again, we have right-wing forces and white supremacists who, instead of being addressed on their own, in their own legacies of violence, they are most often tethered to the idea that Muslim violence remains the gold standard. And when it is addressed, what happens is that measures that are employed serve to target Muslims again. We're also dealing with the globe, entire countries moving towards fascism, right? And when we move towards fascism, communities that are already marginalized and excluded, such as Muslims, become ever more marginalized. So as we continue as Muslims, right, continue to reel from and address this ongoing and visceral state violence, our panel will look at what Islamophobia looks like in the US and beyond, and what the interventions that are necessary to fight it. Our incredible panelists will speak to the imperative for progressive movements to take seriously this form of oppression and to avoid relegating it as a side note or as adjacent to other forms of oppression, such as anti-Semitism, in recognition of the fact that Islamophobia has been institutionalized by the state and therefore requires interventions that go beyond its interpersonal manifestations. There are many definitions of Islamophobia, and we could go on and on about what it is. I typically refer to it as a constructed hate and fear of Muslims. It's contrived, right? It's not irrational. It's contrived because if you look at the way Muslims are constructed, they do look scary. That is the point, right? It is to present them as scary, monstrous figures. And it's based on the social constructions, Muslims as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values. It pushes Muslims outside of the moral boundaries. And when it does that, it means that Muslims are vulnerable to state violence, right? And finally, what I'll say about Islamophobia is that it's a complicated system of oppression, right? Because it's very intersectional. Muslims occupy, right, and have many different identities, whether it's being a black Muslim, whether it's being a non-black Arab Muslim. There are many different identities. There's intersectional identities. So it requires us to go deeper and understand what Islamophobia really is at the nexus of all of these other systems of oppression. So to help us move through this discussion, I'm really excited to introduce our incredible panelists, and I'm sure you are too, because I know some of you in this room, and we're all in good company. So we have 4 panelists today. The first that I'll introduce to my left is Paige Ingram, who is a nomadic Muslim abolitionist and reparationist based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She currently serves as the cross-movement lead organizer with the Movement for Black Lives and the leadership team for the Rising Majority. Prior to M4BL, Paige worked in faith organizing, building third space pluralistic spiritual communities for Black people. To Paige's left is Fatima Ahmed. Fatima Ahmed is the executive director of Muslim Justice League, and she will speak to how Islamophobia has been a systemic issue in US foreign and domestic policy for at least 100 years, and how solidarity organizing can uncover how Islamophobia impacts more than just Muslims and people perceived to be Muslim. Next is Rama Kudemi, who is the Crescendo Project Campaign Director for ACRE, which focuses on corporate complicity in anti-Muslim bigotry. She was previously Deputy Director at the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. She served on the Washington Peace Board Center and has been a member of the National Committee of the War Resisters League. She has vast experience running campaigns in support of progressive causes, facilitation, and strategic planning and coalition building. And last but not least is Rima Ahmed, who is an organizer and political strategist whose career building grassroots power and civic engagement within AAPI, immigrant, Muslim, and Arab communities has included national, state, and local advocacy. Her campaign and policy work spans immigrant rights, advocacy, BIPOC coalition building, developing and running new American leaders for public office, and cultivating multiracial progressive statewide ecosystems in the Midwest. And she's currently a senior state advisor with Movement Voter Project, where she connects some of the most innovative grassroots organizing groups to funding, tools, and trainings to support each other. So we've organized this panel as a conversation, and we have questions for the panelists, and we'll invite you at the end to ask questions of them. So please keep those in mind as we move through the panel. And without further ado, I'm gonna just quickly say what the questions are and have our panelists answer. So our first question for the panelists is, for Fatima and Paige, why must we focus on Islamophobia at this moment? And how does Islamophobia manifest beyond the obvious example of the Muslim ban? So Fatima and Paige, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to folks wearing keffiyehs in this space and wherever you are. It is a failure of the left to have not reckoned with Islamophobia and our foreign policy every year, every day, as we continue to murder people directly and indirectly in Palestine, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I can't name all of the countries. It is a failure of the left to have not reckoned with this. And to continue in this moment to be shocked that our communities are fed up with not talking about it as our people are killed and massacred daily. We have to reckon with it. We have to center it. We have to get rooted in this. It doesn't just impact us, and it doesn't just impact people abroad, it impacts all communities here. And every time that we let Muslims, sit on the chopping block in terms of policies, it will come back to haunt everyone, as it is in this moment. So one of the reasons why we said, why we're calling this Beyond the Muslim Ban and using that as a point of reference is because I'm sure many people remember, may have been at Muslim ban rallies, right? Where there was an outpouring of support, and yet I don't think all of that was actually about solidarity, right? It was a bit shallow. A lot of that was about responding to Trump, about being seen as being on the right side of history, without understanding what actually led to the Muslim ban. Not just here in the US, but if you've heard of the Great Replacement theory, that actually comes from Europe, where, again, Muslims are the big, scary threat migrating there. And so even when we talk about the war on terror, right, which I think most of us hate that terminology to begin with, but we have to understand that it doesn't start with 9/11. 9/11 is one point. The war on terror is not just 20 years long. 9/11 was actually in response to the war on terror that has been going on for at least a century, right? If you even look back, way, way, way back, the start of the US Navy was actually about responding to quote unquote Barbary pirates and not wanting to essentially pay a tax for sailing through there, which has parallels to maybe some of what we're seeing today with Yemen. So we have to get rooted in that here in the US and globally, because as Meha said, right, this is a driving force behind fascism everywhere you go. Across Europe, where shockingly, in certain countries in Europe, right, the repression is much worse than it is here. It's bad here, sure, but if you go to Germany, it's pretty much illegal to be Palestinian, right? And so much of that has been driven by Islamophobia, right, and not reckoning with the settler colonization and the imperialism that has led to this. So if you're really taking a step back from the Muslim ban, from the Great Replacement theory, from that migration to say, well, why are all of these people migrating, right? Oh, it's because we invaded all of their countries, we took all of their resources, we've made it completely unlivable, we've propped up all of these dictators, we've drone bombed them every day, again and again and again. And now we're so concerned that they're coming here, and we're most concerned when they resist, right? It's not the war on terror, it's the war on resistance. We are seen as violent, forever responding in any way, right? Violent or non-violent, any kind of response is seen as extreme, as radical, as terrorism. And before I pass to Paige, I'll just leave with one other historical note, which is, you know, even in terms of thinking about policing in the US, right? It goes way past 9/11. It goes even further past COINTELPRO, which folks might be aware of. The roots of COINTELPRO come out of the 1930s when the FBI was forming and met Black Muslims and said, oh no, they're vocally against white supremacy.
Talk about it.
And that Islam for them is about social justice, and that Islam was seen as this foreign radicalizing threat. They literally said, oh, they're fanatics of racial equality, and launched the first surveillance program in the US to investigate this, right? To investigate why we're standing up. I am a fanatic of racial equality, in fact, and proud to be. I'll pass to Paige.
Thank you. Thank you. Y'all doing all right? We haven't acknowledged y'all. Everyone okay? All right, this is heavy stuff, but it's necessary things. Well, first of all, I really have to be transparent about where I come from, because I come from a place where you can't talk about Islamophobia without also talking about anti-Blackness. I live in Minneapolis. I'm very proud of that. I live in a place where Black Lives Matter and every single iteration of the Black liberation movement since then has very largely been led by Black Muslim people, practicing or otherwise, right? And so I say that because it's tough. The question is, why must we focus on Islamophobia at this moment? And I can't just talk about one without the other. However, I will make a note about the importance of specificity, because this is something that a lot of folks in Black movement have had to navigate. Why just Black people? Why not all people of color? Well, sometimes you do have to be specific, and I think that when it comes to Islamophobia in this moment, I feel that very concretely, that there is a conflation, or that there are whataboutisms. There is a drive from folks with all sorts of motivations to link Islamophobia with anti-Semitism. But we have to be specific in order to right our failings, like you were mentioning on the left, you know, and that's okay for us, and that's okay for us to say we have to talk about Islamophobia, period, you know, because that's what Black folks have had to do. That's what we continue to do when we say we need a Black autonomous space. There's a reason why we need Black autonomous space, and I think that I feel very strongly about us being able to be 10 toes down on that, and we have to fortify each other when we get the pushback, right? Because it's inevitable. Whenever you want to talk about you, there's 10 other people that also want to talk about all the other things. But what happens is that we end up staying shallow and not getting specific, and we end up nowhere. We will be in another one of these moments, likely, where we are feeling the catastrophe of whatever is a policy, a capital P political expression of Islamophobia. And it is our mandate, it's hard to speak for everybody, but it is my mandate and the mandate of the people who I'm accountable for, as people who want to change the world and be revolutionary, to do things differently. I also really appreciated the point you made, Fatima, about resistance, because that has been the characterized feature of Black Muslim political and social expression historically. And I also think that Black resistance in the last 10 years of this most recent iteration of the Black liberation movement has truly paved the way for us to get where we are right now, where we have an entire generation of young people who see political protests and social and political resistance as an imperative, as a norm, as something necessary, that other people can be emboldened based off of the courageous acts of young Black people in particular over the course of the last 10 years. So this didn't happen in a vacuum. We don't get uncommitted without all of this other stuff. We don't get people on the streets in mobilization after mobilization and creative action after creative action without really getting grounded in that. And the other thing that I was thinking about is this notion of Muslim people as violent and barbaric and uncivilized, and how for Black people in America, we recognize that. It sounds familiar, right? Because this is a part of a Black pathology, a so-called Black pathology that has been overlaid across our communities, that we are violent, that we are uncivilized criminals. And there is an uncomfortable part of this, because there have been many instances in which Muslim leadership has forwarded that narrative. And so this is why it's important to be having these conversations and to get specific, because we have to unroot some of that, both what we need to do in the outside world and what we need to address intra-communally, in order for us to get past this, be more unified, be clear about where we're coming from in our shared histories, in order to move forward in a more fortified way. And I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much, Fatima and Paige. Really, really, really helpful framing and intriguing discussion. So my next question is for Rima and Rama. So oftentimes when we talk about Islamophobia, it's discussed as part of a right-wing agenda. But we've all seen Islamophobia manifest itself across the political spectrum, right? We often assume that progressives and the left have rid themselves of Islamophobia, but we know that's not true. So can you talk about what it looks like in these progressive spaces and how we can uproot and dismantle and really address them so we can sort of become more politically aligned and really address Islamophobia?
Yeah, thank you. What an honor it is to be on this panel with a bunch of such thoughtful people who've been in the work and in the streets for so long. I can't begin to answer this question before first understanding and explaining a little bit more around how Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism are intrinsically connected. And to your point, Paige, right, like specificity is important, but we also need to really understand the dotted lines that exist in the history here. And in fact, folks may know that the Center for Constitutional Rights recently, a few months ago, spells out exactly how opposition to Palestinian rights has shaped U.S. federal policy on anti-terrorism laws from its very beginnings in the 1960s, and was specifically designated to target the Palestinian movement and supporters and to stigmatize Palestinians as terrorists. And so, again, when we talk about Islamophobia today, in this moment, 10 months into a U.S.-funded and supported genocide, we must understand the dots that directly connect anti-Palestinian animus, the war on terror policies post 9/11, and attacks currently on pro-Palestinian activists and organizers today. So yeah, that's the grounding I have to hold in understanding all of this. Because the truth is that almost every layer of civic society today, we've seen examples of Islamophobia embedded in progressive spaces. And just, you know, looking at the surface in Congress, we saw Palestinian members, progressive members of Congress capitulate to the likes of J Street in omitting calls for a ceasefire from sign-on letters to the administration. And then months later, vote to censure one of their own, our Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, from speaking on the ongoing genocide going on in Gaza. In advocacy spaces, we've seen attempts to drown out organizers utilizing the mechanisms, the tactics that we know as organizers exist, whether it's bird dogging, it's meeting with our members of Congress, you know, going out to events. We've seen attempts to drown out those organizers from holding truth to power, either by calling them Russian operatives, go back to Russia from whence you came, as you know, Nancy Pelosi famously said, or accusing them of simply paving a way for a second Trump presidency, and in that way being selfish and not caring about other constituencies that would be impacted by rising fascism. And then within other organizing spaces, we've seen, on college campuses, we've seen direct attacks, the likes of which I think is, I wouldn't call it unprecedented, because living in the belly of the beast, we know that this has existed for many other constituencies and many other periods of movement organizing. But the direct connections between the hyper-militarization of our police forces and attacks on college campuses and free speech, specifically because of speaking out around this ongoing genocide. I think, it's worthwhile to make these connections. And in the opposite direction too, right, if we talk about the connections between Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, not only do we need to understand the core, but we need to also be careful not to conflate too. Because if we only look at this moment through a lens of broad Islamophobia, right, then we're not able to actually fully address what is happening when it comes to, students on campuses, again, to use this example, being targeted for their Palestinian activism. And the solution isn't simply, well, we're going to bring in a Muslim chaplain to help you all feel better represented by the administration. And so these are just a couple of the ways that this is coming up. I know we're going to have a conversation more about how institutions and are being complicit in perpetuating Islamophobia, but I want to make sure that Rama here has a chance to speak as well.
Thanks, Rima. And like Rima said, the specificity is so important, and Paige was saying as well, and how going deeper allows us to then think about what we need to do in response. But particularly these last 9 months, and the continuing way that we've seen Islamophobia come out by people saying things like, well, like I said, you all want Trump, he's going to come back the Muslim ban, and using that as a way to shut down any real solidarity with Palestinian folks because we're being threatened by this over and over again. It just shows again in terms of how Muslims are seen as just nothing more than just pawns in this political game of just like, well, when we need you, we're going to be in solidarity. When we don't need you, we're going to come after you. And there's this concept of good Muslim versus bad Muslim that the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani wrote a book about a while back. But everyone has their good Muslim and everyone has their bad Muslim. So for Dems, the good Muslim in this moment is the one who says, okay, yes, what's happening in Gaza is bad, but Biden, we're going to all come together and support him in the end. And for right-wingers, the good Muslim is the one who says, no, we don't want Biden. We're going to go support Trump because supposedly he's better on quote-unquote social issues that supposedly Muslims align with more. And so again, this idea of just like Muslims ourselves don't have any political needs, any social needs. It's all about what is better for whatever political project the people are in power. And to be very clear, like Islamophobia is a bipartisan issue. Like the war on terror, again, being specific, a lot of what we're talking about is in a post 9/11 world. We're saying that nothing that's been happening has rooted in the history in the past, like Fatma was saying. But particularly in a post 9/11 world, the global war on terror has been fought by both Democrats and Republicans. Sure, it was George W. Bush that launched it in 2001, but Obama made himself a reputation of being the drone chief. In the infamous Tuesday meetings where he'd go through a list and be like, yeah, this is who you should drone strike. Obama came into power and said, I'm going to shut down Guantanamo. We're now in 2024, and Guantanamo is still open with dozens of folks still held there with no charges and everything. And this is, again, a prison created specifically for Muslim folks to be held in a post 9/11 world. And so I think it's very important that we talk about this wide range while we talk about Islamophobia being part of a global fascist project, we cannot ignore it, how it's in our midst. And one particular example that I'll end on is, so-called liberal organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, who like to put themselves out there as we are concerned with the civil rights. Jonathan Greenblatt infamously said in 2016, after Biden started talking about the Muslim ban, that this proud Jew would register as a Muslim in the database. That was his way to be like, I'm in solidarity with Muslim folks who are going to be coming under attack under Trump. Well, the ADL is a well-known racist, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Black organization. And earlier this year, Greenblatt and the ADL have been making demands of the FBI and the US government to use material support laws to go after student activists on campuses. So frankly, we don't need this type of shallow solidarity that you're going to be against the Muslim ban if then when we are resisting, as other folks have saying, you are going to call the government to come after us.
Thank you so much, Rima and Rama. And I think you both brought up really important points. And as we are, attending this conference, Netroots Nation, right? And we're theoretically in a space of progressives and liberals and people on the left. We have to really interrogate, right? What are our politics, right? And how are we moving together or not? And so I really appreciate how all of you have really centered Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, right? Because we need to address them right now with a lot of urgency. So my next question is for Fatima and Rama. And I want you to both comment on and tell us a little bit about who specifically benefits from an Islamophobic agenda?
I'm going to answer this in a different way, which is who is impacted by it? Just everybody, right? I think that, as Rama said, this has gone on for a long time, and since 9/11, we have built up the national security state in a way that should terrify you every day. We should all be talking about it. We should all be very, very concerned, and instead, it not only had bipartisan support, but cheerleading from everybody to build this up, assuming that it would only impact certain communities, right? I've had, we're deep in student encampments in Boston. So I've had students ask about, what do we do about FBI infiltration and FBI visits, and I've been reminding them, this is a daily occurrence for our communities, even when we're not active. My parents were visited by the FBI before I took on this kind of work. By our research in Boston, 1 in 10 Muslims have either personally or someone close to them in their family has been visited by the FBI. That is not something everyone else is dealing with assuming an FBI agent is going to knock on your door at home or at your work and question you. But it will come for everybody. anyone in power benefits by the Islamophobic agenda, right? Because building up the counterterrorism complex, building up the national security machine, that is fascism. It is already here. If you are concerned about Project 2025, if you think fascism is coming, well, we paved the way for it. We paved the way for it. We said, sure, we will create the Department of Homeland Security, now the second largest department, right? The second biggest shift in our government since creating the Department of War. We will create ICE. We will militarize the border. We will hand over militarized equipment to local law enforcement. We will create fusion centers, which we have a panel on later, where all law enforcement can communicate with each other, share information, because we think this is only going to impact a certain community, right? And now we see it everywhere. It's Stop Cop City. All the counter-extremism and domestic terrorism policies that folks are facing came from this. It impacts everyone. We have kids in Boston getting deported to El Salvador based on gang allegations because we said, sure, the Department of Homeland Security can have cameras and access to everything from the Boston Police Department that they want. It is only going to get worse unless we understand that we are all impacted. And solidarity organizing is really powerful. We have an incredible coalition in Boston, abolitionist organizing led by us, because Muslims are impacted by the whole alphabet soup of law enforcement. We're the only community that can expect the FBI, TSA, ICE, all of them, local law enforcement, to be all up in our business at some point. And so it's easy for our community members to say, well, yeah, we know what this feels like. And so building that solidarity, understanding that, you know, the mechanisms through which local police departments are being militarized, by which the border and immigration law is being impacted, even surveillance of, you know, reproductive justice, right? That it's all coming together through law enforcement, through the national security state. We are so much more powerful when we see that and work together on it.
Thanks, Fatma. And like Fatma was saying, she's right. Everyone is impacted, and the national security states benefit. And there are corporate actors and Wall Street firms and institutions that specifically are profiting from all of this Islamophobia. That's the work I do through Crescendos, looking at corporate accountability in relationship to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And so when we're talking about what does it mean to profit off of Islamophobia, we're talking about the weapons companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, who profit off of war all across the globe, and particularly in this moment in the genocide in Gaza. We're talking about big tech companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, who profit also from the same wars, but in a different way. I think a lot of time we've built up this idea of like, well, it's the weapon companies that are like making the most profit. In the last 2 decades, tech has grown tremendously in its relationship with the national security state, and we need to be really aware of that, because they like to like launder themselves as like, oh, what are these progressive, cool, you know, everyone wants to be a Google employee, and it's like, you know what Google is up to? Obviously, oil companies, the private mercenaries, who also again reap the benefits of war. Two things I'd ask people to look up is the No Tech for Apartheid campaign, which specifically looks at Project Nimbus and the contracts Amazon and Google have with the state of Israel, particularly providing cloud services and AI technology. Again, this is, you know, a lot of people are labeling what the genocide in Gaza that Israel is carrying out as one of like the first AI generated wars. We have a report that we did with several partners called DHS Open for Business that particularly looks at how corporations like Microsoft actually helped build up DHS, that they saw this as an opportunity of like, oh, okay, people are talking about national security, how can we make profit off of it? And that they drove the demands around national security because they knew there was money to be made out of this. And the way that Muslim folks across the globe are actually used to test weapons out. Again, Israel very clearly does this in Gaza for decades. Russia did it in Syria. China does it around surveillance technology that they use against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And again, it's this idea of like terror capitalism. Someone has labeled it as just like there's profit in terrorism. And the most clear example, like we've labeled it to who in these days to label terrorists as Muslims. And it's also around like, you know, the policies that are shared across these states in terms of like how, you know, China has modeled, for example, its re-education camps that it does for Uyghur Muslims behind policies that it learned from the US war on terror and Israel's own war on terror and war on Palestinians specifically. And the forced labor that they use, for example, Uyghurs for, helps for companies from Apple to Nike to BMW and dozen more. So like this idea again of just like Muslims have become this population where you can test things out, where you can exploit, and as long as you call them terrorists, people are like, okay, I mean terrorists, of course terrorists are bad, like why should we care about them? And then we obviously have like right-wing media corporations, we have social media platforms like Facebook, X/Twitter, WhatsApp. All of these have been able to generate, again, from genocide, the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar to the genocide of Muslims in India. Like, this is all, and it's, again, there's profit making it out of that because the business model of these social media companies is we push right-wing terrible things, and there's profit in that. And so it makes you also think like, well, what is the solution to that other than dismantling, you know, the way this business model even works? Like, why is there profit making in genocide against our people? And then we have like Wall Street firms. Fatima and I work on a campaign around Fidelity and the role of Fidelity plays through its Fidelity Charitables and its donor advised funds to just grant money to right-wing Hindutva groups, to Zionist groups, to anti-black groups, anti-immigrant groups, like, and it's just like, oh, well, the IRS gives them charitable status, so we allow this money to go. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars that is just being funded to these nonprofits that, you know, are spreading these oppressive policies across the globe. So I think it's very essential that, like, I think sometimes, you know, we focus a lot on the policy, and I want to get people to think, like, the corporations, the banks, the Wall Street firms are profiting all of this, and sometimes it is actually easier to convince a corporation to change its course than the politicians. And so that's like another added layer of how we think about tackling this problem.
Thank you so much, Rahman, Fatima. So our last question before I turn it over to the audience is for Paige and Rima. And Paige and Rima, could you talk a little bit about how institutional systemic Islamophobia makes organizing within our communities more difficult?
I'll be brief. I'm cognizant of time. I think the thing that I'm sitting with right now is not just the way that people think about our Muslim communities as pawns, that was said, but also I think that there is an imperative for those of us Muslim people who are organizing our communities where we cannot fall into that as well. I'll speak locally again, but this is a trend all around, which is that not even just prior to October, but also continuing after October, it has been very apparent that there has been right capture of Muslim communities, and that's painful, and it feels strange sometimes, and it's very contradictory, right? How do you work with people that you hate, or who hate you, more importantly? And that has been in the organizing circles that I'm in a huge elephant in the room. The right-wing folks saying, hey, you too are religiously conservative. How do you feel about all of this gay stuff, right? Well, what that does is that creates a narrative that our communities just are too far gone, are too unwavering, are too whatever. And we cannot count our people out. And I think that applies to many communities, but we're speaking specifically on Muslim ones. But what it takes, it's the same conversation pretty much no matter what issue, no matter what community, is it takes a proper investment in door knocking, in traditional organizing structures, because the mobilizing is lit, okay? I love to be on the streets with my people. I do. Man, wow. The things that I have seen, the people who I have seen come together on the streets, who I never thought would be on the streets, is incredible. And everybody leaves it there, right? And so if we don't take the fundamentals of community organizing seriously, then we are seeding our people, right? Because two things can be true at the same time. So I think that we have an incredible opportunity to capture the energy of this moment and the incredible protagonism that has come from this moment from Muslim people. And we have to talk to our folks, because the right capture threat is not going away, no matter what other intersections that we see. So that's the thing that's on top of my mind right now.
I'm gonna end up right there with you with base building and organizing, but just specifically talking about how organizing in these communities, in our communities, is harder for the systemic Islamophobia. We don't need to theorize on this, right? I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Milwaukee. I've done a ton of work in Chicago. These areas, the Midwest, is where there's the largest concentration of Palestinian communities in the country, where I grew up knowing that, this uncle or that, community member was being surveilled for their humanitarian work, for their organizing work, for speaking out. And so it makes it harder because of the terrorism laws that we've talked about, because of the creep of the surveillance state that has been noted, and the fact that this has been institutionalized and is pervasive right now is a huge threat to the organizing. But to your point, the solution isn't a chilling effect on our communities. The solution is building real power. So when our communities, next to other communities are lined up and making different demands, the powers that be must listen. Right. And that only happens through the base building organizing that I know a lot of folks in this room hopefully are plugged into, but certainly that exists in every single one of our communities must be invested. We must stop tiptoeing around certain issues. If we have a set of values, let's apply those values equally across communities and fund accordingly.
So I want to take 2 or 3 minutes, we're very short on time, to see if anyone in the audience has questions. We probably only have time for 2 questions. And Paige here will run the mic. Kate. Thank you, Paige.
Yeah. Okay, I got one back.
And we'll just take both of them right after each other, and then we'll have to move on to our ending.
I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on what happened last year at Netroots, and have you been able to process what the world would have been like if people had listened to y'all last year at Netroots?
Thank you so much.
So yeah, thank you for having a conversation on shallow solidarity at Netroots. I think that takes a lot out of you, and I really really appreciate it. I want to talk about, when we talk about base building and building power, is that actually happening across the left, or is it about base building and replacing the left structures that exist now? Like, how do you think about organizing within and outside of the existing left movement?
So I will defer to you, our lovely panelists, as to who wants to answer what questions.
Netroots last year. For folks who may not know, actually, how many people were at Netroots last year? Okay, so folks may remember there was some incredible organizing that went down. It came out of a panel that actually talked about issues not too dissimilar from the ones that we're talking about here, but was namely rooted around the fact that Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky was speaking on a plenary, and this was in Chicago, in a place where organizers had been pushing the Congresswoman to sign on a bill, to sign on to a resolution, basically just saying that we should not support Israel imprisoning children, like baseline. You know, this is last July. And so what we saw was some incredible organizing that happened inside of the plenary, disrupting the plenary, trying to, call on Jan Schakowsky to support this resolution and, basically be on the record in front of all of these progressives for why she maybe wouldn't be doing this. And in the weeks and months since, there were conversations with Netroots around just better having a conversation about and centering Palestine as core to the other progressive issues that we uphold as like a premier progressive conference. And so, I think here this is a larger conversation around progressives except for Palestine. Like, what could it look like if we actually had the same values applied in all communities and on all these different issues? I wonder, when October 7th happened, if there would have been a more widespread upswelling of understanding what was underway using our tax dollars, and in some ways in our name, if we had actually done some deeper, not again, kind of getting to your shallow solidarity point as well, if there was deeper work that was underway across our different communities instead of Palestine being at the fringes of progressive organizing spaces.
Yeah, I'll add to that and thinking also like what alternatives we need. We're not over 9 months into a genocide. We would not be 9 months into a genocide if folks took seriously the reality of anti-Palestinian racism, of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism in the progressive, liberal, democratic, whatever space you want to label it as. I think we've all been witnessing these last few weeks the freakouts that have been happening around Biden's performance at the debate, and oh my God, is this now the time to replace him? I don't know, folks 9 months ago told you this is going to be a problem because the guy is Genocide Joe. And so I think it's been, I can speak, I think on all of our behalf that it's been very frustrating. We've been having all this like, why is this moment the moment that folks are freaking out? And not again 9 months ago when it became very clear that Biden was going to full on support the genocide with the weapons, with the vetoes at the UN, and all the other ways that he's doing. And obviously Netanyahu is going to be, an hour away from here in Congress in a few weeks as well. And so it's just like welcoming arms. And so I think the reality is, I don't know, like we're here at Netroots. So obviously I think we all believe there is still some sort of interventions we can make in the spaces that are already provided, that we can't completely cede these spaces either because they are important spaces. And also, yeah, I think collectively, we need to be thinking about alternatives to the Democratic Party, to the liberal space, to the progressive space. And so how do you balance of both, like, we intervene where we can in these important moments because a genocide needs to be stopped, and these interventions are necessary, but also I think we do need to be thinking how are we building also the alternatives?
Great. Thanks. I was like, can I? The last question felt very provocative. I wasn't at Netroots last year, so I'm not going to speak on something I don't know, but yes. But the last question, I think, for me, I should also transparently say I'm on the leadership team of the Rising Majority, and we are trying to take on this question about, I think it's about how are we working differently. There are times when I'm like, do we really need another organization? I don't think that adding more organizations addresses the organizing crisis that we're in. And what's happening right now is that organizations across the country are going, oh my God, I need to build a base. Guess what, boo? You're not building a base in 116 days until the election, right? So what do we do with that? What we do with that is that we have to think at a longer term. And we have to be an exercise around being in coalition. We need to be clear about who the people are around us and decide, who do I need to be in tactical relationship with? That's different than partnership, right? I can be in a tactical relationship with a centrist organization that does not align necessarily with the abolitionist politic that my organization has, because I'm clear about what's necessary to build power to get us on the other side. So we are limited in what we can do in terms of addressing this crisis with this time frame that we feel like is the only time frame. And there are opportunities for us to vision multiple decades into the future. There are opportunities for us to strategize not just from a year to year, or not just on a 3 or 4 or 5 year plan. Let's do a decade-long strategy. So that was both my honest opinion and a pitch to get with the rising majority, if you're down, if this sounds good to you, Paige Ingram and the thing, but it's real.
I know we're slightly over, but if I could just add, yeah, I was not at Netroots last year, not typically here, because, yeah, I'm not typically invested in spaces that are progressive except for Palestine. And I think, you know, to what folks are saying, right, a lot of, when I say progressive, I usually mean progressive except for Palestine, and you can see how those folks are saying that we're so disruptive in this moment, right? We're doing too much, we're not being reasonable. And some of those folks are throwing out like, well, you know, if this happens, if we go down this path, right, they're gonna take everyone's rights away, they're gonna impact queer and trans folks, they're gonna impact so-and-so. When I was arrested for Palestine, we were in the holding cell, like, this is the gayest group that has been in Boston's holding cell in a long time. Like, all of my friends who are trans are actually risking their safety every day right now for Palestine. It is the new front. We need a new principled left.
Yes.
We all see ourselves in Palestine, all of the folks who are mobilizing. And so it is not about us, you know, being out here and extreme and radical, right? All of the counterterrorism language. This is the new front, and people need to get with it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to all of you. I'm sure you have all benefited from this incredible conversation with our amazing panelists. Please follow them. Please connect with them at Netroots. They're amazing. Follow their organizations, follow their work. Paige Ingram, Fatima Ahmed, Rama Kudemi, and Rima Ahmed. Just a couple of announcements. We will be posting a resource list, a Padlet, on the app with some of the things that our panelists have mentioned, so look out for that. Second, there is a War on Terror exhibit right outside these doors called Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat, which is a timeline of the War on Terror and the way it's impacted Muslims. Third, we do have a Muslim caucus at 10:45 in room 325, so please join us.
11:45.
Oh, 11:45. I lost track of time. 11:45, so please join us. And then finally, just a plug for my book, which is Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11, really speaks to a lot of what we've talked about today and the urgency of addressing Islamophobia. And I'm going to leave you with one question that I didn't get to ask the panelists, and which you should all be asking at this conference, which is, how do we do better to combat Islamophobia as part of the progressive agenda in the US? So please ask yourselves that question, ask others, and talk to the panelists. Thank you so much.
I can't wait.